All right, this evening we are going to do the butt joint. A butt joint is just two parallel plates fixed together on a even plane. So I, just like you guys should, I'm going to grab some scrap that I have. I found these from last time, and I'm going to just place them together. Now, if you guys go to the scrap bin, you can find some nice plates like this. Obviously, I've already sanded mine from previous times, but you might find some other scrap plate that you'll need to clean up a little bit with the grinder, and then you should be able to weld it. I'm not going to put any gap between these two plates for practice purposes. Now, just know that the weld, again, is only penetrating very slightly below the surface. If I were to give a little bit of a gap between these two plates, or even take this edge and grind that corner down so it's a little bit of a slope, we call it a bevel. If I were to do that bevel on both sides, I could heat up more of the surface area of the metal at once and allow for a weld to penetrate deeper into the surface. For this assignment though, I'm not going to be looking particularly for full penetration on this weld. I want to see a consistent bead down the length of the joint. I want to make sure that also as you weld this straight line that you don't waver or wander off the side of the weld. We want to make sure that you can keep it straight down the center of that joint. So essentially it's really another practice of your first assignment of doing 3 beads, except it's a single bead down that line, and we would like you to go the entire way, so about 3 inches. I got a nice sharp point on my tungsten. Using my markers on the table here, I'm verifying I do have this tungsten out approximately 3/8 of an inch. For this welding assignment, I would also choose to pick the thinner filler rod. If by chance I was going to weld with a little bit of a gap between these two plates, or like I said, a bevel on those plates, I might use the bigger 3/32 filler rod. But since I'm going to close this gap between the plates, I'm going to weld with a 1/16 filler. Now that I got my plates ready to go, my gear is on, I'm going to weld. Again, I typically will sit down and get very comfortable. I like to rest both my hands on the table, and I want to try and make one clean sweep with my wrist, and that's the motion I'm going for. Just like this. I want to make sure I can follow along that joint without being impeded. Okay, now that I feel like I've done enough test runs, I'm good to go. Before I start to weld, I usually will tack both ends. As you weld, the heat will cause the metal to expand and contract and move. So I want to make sure they stay put. I can use filler rod, or again, I can use an autogenous tack by just letting the base metal fuse together. Cover. Now that I have it tacked together, I'm going to go ahead and weld down that joint. Cover. After I weld one side, I can always flip it over and attempt to weld the other. Now, when you're finding metal out of the scrap, sometimes you can only get one side welded, but you always have a second attempt to weld up the back side. In industry, welding both sides of the joint, if possible, will result in the strongest end result as well, unless we can ensure that we have full penetration from one side. But for practice sake, we are just trying to be able to follow that straight line and weld a consistent bead. I'll try this one with the bigger filler rod. With the bigger filler rod, I just barely have to touch the front of the filler rod to the puddle to allow It's a dab just barely in. With a 16th filler rod, you may find yourself having to feed it into the puddle a little bit more. There's the side welded with the 332 filler rod. There's the side welded with 1/16 filler rod. All right, so there's weld number 3 on TIG welding the butt joint. So at this point, you've done straight beads on a plate, you've done a lap joint, and now you've done a butt joint. You ready to go weld?